She reached up to the sky of stars and caught the red-hot light of the North Star. Opened the earth, walking with blood-soaked feet. She challenged the whip, the gun, the knife. She challenged the fire, pulled from the bodies of slaves, made into laws, prisons, and courts. Screaming white-hot flames and agony, she challenged millions of headhunters, dragging and ripping apart impossible tender moments of time, shipping vessels of history, ancient history, destroying the fabric, the godlike claw of destiny, of a people with a gun, a knife, a cannon, building the hideous wall of blood called slavery.
Good afternoon and welcome back. As always, according to the Associated Press, crowds of angry people about the way President Donald Trump is running the country marched and rallied in scores of American cities Saturday, in the biggest day of demonstrations yet by an opposition movement trying to regain its momentum after the shock of the Republicans' first week in office. What were the marches about? Or more importantly, what weren't they about? Let's connect some dots and find out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.
Welcome to the Connecting the Dots podcast with Dr. Wilmer Leon, and I am Wilmer Leon. Here's the point. We have a tendency to view current events as though they take place in a vacuum, failing to understand the broader historic context in which they occur, thus enabling, during each episode, my guest and I have probing, provocative, and in-depth discussions that connect the dots between these events and the broader historic context in which they take place, thus enabling you to better understand and analyze the events that are impacting the global village in which we live. On today's episode, the issue before us is, in the name of morality, a number of things were protested against this past weekend. The Zionist military in occupied Palestine murdered hundreds of women and children, but not a word about that, to my knowledge, was spoken. Netanyahu is in D.C. meeting with Trump. Not a word. Is this selective outrage and morality? Let's talk to my guest. He's the director of the North-South Project for People-Centered Human Rights and an editor and contributing columnist for the Black Agenda Report. He serves on the executive committee of the U.S. Peace Council and leadership body of the U.S.-based United National Anti-War Coalition and the steering committee of the Black is Back Coalition. Brother Ajamu Baraka, as always, welcome back.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
So, I've looked at a lot of the coverage from the AP, from CNN, from NPR, and a number of other outlets about the protests this past weekend, and they describe the protests as thousands of protesters in cities dotting the nation from Midtown Manhattan to Anchorage, Alaska, including at multiple state capitals, assailed Trump and billionaire Elon Musk's actions on government downsizing, the economy, immigration, human rights. Demonstrators voiced anger over the firing of thousands of federal workers, closing Social Security Administration field offices, effectively shuttering entire agencies, deporting immigrants, scaling back protections for transgender people, and cutting of health programs. They even talked about this is the only thing I found out relative to the Palestinian issue. The arrest of Mahmoud Khalil, a Palestinian refugee, as he's described, whose green card was revoked over his involvement at Columbia, raised people's concerns regarding free speech. That's as close as I could get to a discussion about the genocide in Gaza. Selective morality? Ajamu Baraka.
Dr. Leon, I think you hit the nail on the head. And this is why it's so difficult for the Democrat Party to be an effective oppositional party. The people who support the Democrats, who vote Democrat, seem to be more committed to the interests of the party and the party bosses than the values and beliefs that these individuals claim to uphold. And therefore, they find themselves in positions where they are attempting to justify Democrat Party positions that are, in essence, objectively immoral. The idea that you can have a nationwide mobilizations against the Trump administration and not utter a word about this ongoing slaughter of Palestinian people it really signifies the fundamental backwardness and immoral character of politics in the United States of America. Now, it's understandable, Dr. Leon, why they couldn't do that. It's understandable because, of course, the Trump administration is building off of the reality and the logic of the policies that were put in place under Joe Biden. Like Joe Biden, Donald Trump is a Zionist that supports the Zionist cause and therefore is supporting what is the final solution that the Zionists have been advocating for quite some time to their little issue in Palestine. What is that little issue? Well, that little issue is the fact that Palestinians still exist. The Palestinians are still occupying land that they want to own themselves. That is the settlers, and so they would like to cleanse the Palestinians from what they consider to be Greater Israel or the potential of Greater Israel, which means to clear them out of the so-called West Bank and Gaza. But up until now, they have been reluctant to execute that final solution, to do what they believe is necessary to get rid of, to eliminate Amalek, as the Benjamin Netanyahu and his defense minister referred to the Palestinians. Amalek, human animals, and the excuse that they were able to use for people who have no historic memory and people who are basically immoral is the October 7th attacks from the Palestinian resistance and the subsequent deaths of various Israeli colonialists and others. So this was their opportunity, and because there was no real restraints put on them by the Biden administration and a government that provides all of their armaments, then they attempted to begin the process of executing their final solution. That continues under the Trump administration, and it continues. And it's important to point this out. If the Harris folks would have come into power, the policies would have been the same. The
Hmm.
only difference might be that with Trump and his crudeness, he exposed what was really one of the things that people have been talking about for quite some time in Israel, and that is, what do you do with the territory in Gaza, for example, once you get rid of the Palestinians? And Trump and his honest crudeness said, we're going to make it the Riviera of the Mediterranean, which is in line with the aspirations and interests of his son-in-law and other immoral colonial capitalists who call themselves Israelis and others. That's the only difference. The objectives have been the same. And so the Democrats and the people who vote Democrats are unable to raise this question, the moral question of the moment, and maybe the moral question definitely of the 21st century, but the moral question since the end of the Second World War. This ongoing live stream genocide. They had to be quiet, and that really, I think, signifies the fundamental immorality of that party.
One of the, I'll say, interesting dynamics that I've seen over time is the depiction of this has changed. We are now seeing a lot more of the actual destruction and the actual devastation, the actual genocide. We're seeing a lot more of that play itself out every night on our television sets, but you don't hear from the mainstream media. They'll show you the devastation, but they will not call for an end to the genocide.
Well, you know, it's interesting that you frame it that way, Dr. Leon, because many of us will argue that I think that we have to make the separation between those of us who are exposed to all kind of information from various sources
Mm-hmm.
and that information that is carefully cultivated in the mainstream press. One of the things that I've noted about the mainstream press is that the Gaza story has just about disappeared. That in the beginning, of course, you remember there
Right.
was a lot of those images,
Mm-hmm.
but over the last couple of months, few months,
Okay.
uh, it's
Okay.
almost disappeared, and that's part of the critique that people are having. That basically you have this ongoing slaughter, this mass murder taking place
Mm-hmm.
in the 21st century, and the corporate media has largely just tried to not talk about it. Now they have to from time to time, like the latest controversy with the execution of the medics.
Mm-hmm.
So it is still penetrating through
Yes.
somewhat. Okay,
Yes.
but this is, look, they had to move it off of the screens of the nation because of the kind of opposition it was generating, the moral opposition it was generating among people who had no idea about the kinds of conditions that Palestinians were facing, no idea about the reality
Mm-hmm.
of the Israeli colonial project. And the only reason why they were really being exposed to this was because of the courageous activities of the students keeping this on the front pages. But when they decided, under the leadership of the Biden administration and the Democrats, to suppress, to repress the students, their sons and daughters, they
Mm-hmm.
decided that if they opposed the genocide, they were going to be viciously attacked, and that's what they did. They attacked them, they expelled them, They banned them from campuses, and then over the summer, they had a series of meetings to make sure that when the students came back in the fall, that they would, to the extent possible, undermine the student rebellion. And they've been largely successful, even though we still see some courageous students, largely led by Jewish students.
Mm-hmm.
So this notion that the Trump administration is stepping in to protect Jewish students who are threatened, uncomfortable, or whatever, if you will, is all a blatant lie. Because on most of these campuses, those courageous students who said, "Not in our name," they are the ones who have been organizing opposition, or they're in the forefront of it, and they're the ones who are really bearing a brunt of a lot of the repression also. So, this is the Democrat Party. This is the young demographic that they lost in the last election, and the one that they will continue to lose. And these mobilizations that took place the other day, and when you start looking at the demographics of the people who are coming out, it was very interesting because it wasn't, I mean, depending on the city, you see this is the same demographic, the same foundation, same core of people who voted for Harris. And we see that they are now in the minority.
A couple of things. One, your assessment, now that I think back on, as you said, those of us that are using our access to broader media sources, you're absolutely right. Because now I think back, what I've been reading and where I've been reading it has not been. I've just kind of merged all of this stuff together. So you are correct there. You talk about the students. A lot of people seem to forget you had over 100 Jewish individuals at Trump protesting at Trump Tower about 10 days ago, and they were, of course, arrested, and they were from Not in Our Name, Jewish Voices for Peace, and other progressive Jewish organizations. And then I want to say it was last week you had about 50 or 60 Jewish students chained themselves to the gate at Columbia University and protesting the arrest of Mahmoud Khalil. Interesting too that they label him as a refugee in the NPR story. So again, you're
Which is
right.
very interesting in and
That
of
is a
itself.
lot. Go ahead.
And that's interesting too. That I don't think they understood the import of putting that label on him,
Mm-hmm.
because objectively, in a way, he is a Palestinian refugee, as are millions of
Sure.
others, and particularly the ones who were expelled in 1948, who are still making the
Yes.
claim to a right to return that's been recognized by international law.
Mm-hmm.
So, in their efforts to try to uh, to frame him in a way that was, I don't know why they framed it that way, but again, they have undermined themselves and calling attention to a category that many people in the mainstream, and particularly many people who vote Democrats, hadn't really even thought about before. Because they make a separation between the Palestinians who are still in the territories and the Palestinians who are scattered around the world, and forget that these Palestinians are, in fact, refugees.
And last Tuesday, Senator Cory Booker did his heroic 25-hour speech in the floor of on the floor of the Senate, and everybody has heralded this as just this incredibly courageous and momentous. And oh, thank you, Cory Booker. Thank you. Couple of things. One, I think it exposed the vacuousness of the Democratic Party's position, because why is he acting as a lone soldier on this relative to this protest? Where's the party apparatus behind him is the first question. And then the second question is, in that entire 25-hour speech, he said nothing about the genocide in Gaza. And then today, he was on The View with Whoopi and the whole crew. And they again, thank you, Senator Booker. Oh my God. And he talked about the morality of the moment, did not talk about Gaza. So he seems to be very selective in his moral outrage. And I think the numbers show he got about $750,000 in campaign contributions from AIPAC, Brother Ajamu Baraka.
That's absolutely correct. I mean, it really reflects again the moral bankruptcy of Cory Booker as an individual, The View, and many people who support the Democratic Party. That he can spend 25 hours criticizing Trump policies and never once mention Gaza. That captures it all for me. And then he turns around, and a few days later, what does he do? He joins with the Republicans and most of the Democrats against the Bernie Sanders legislation that would ban the continuation of providing weapons to Israel because of Israel's systematic violation of the human rights of Palestinians, a violation that contradicts U.S. law. That if there are arms being supplied to a nation, U.S. arms, and those arms are used to violate the human rights of individuals and collectives, then those arms have to be discontinued. But they have ignored the law. You know, it goes back to selective morality and selective law, and that's why it's really it undermines the Democrat critique of the Trump administration when they talk about his ignoring of the law, domestic and even international. But they mainly talk about domestic law. But the fact of the matter is, the Democrats colluded with these right-wing forces, external and internal, when it was convenient to ignore the law, as it relates to U.S. Arms being shipped to human rights violators. They ignored all of the obvious evidence that suggested that there was an ongoing genocide in Gaza. And they ignored the responsibility that they had not only to not enable the genocide, but to prevent it and to join in punishing the executioners of that genocide. Instead, they embraced the genocide. Instead, a wanted, indicted war criminal is invited to Washington and invited to the White House. So these are the kind of things that they didn't talk about in the marches the other day. They didn't talk about the fact that Booker and all the rest of them continue to supply arms to a regime that's involved in an ongoing genocide. They talked about hands off this, hands off that, hands off NATO. In other words, basically, it was a pro-war demand that the Democrats are firmly committed to the continuation of a a military structure that many of us oppose because of its imperialist character, because it's been involved uh, in violating the rights of people around the world, of undermining national sovereignty of many people around the world. It's been used as a blunt instrument to advance U.S. Imperialist interests. And it's what these Democrats, these so-called progressives, they want the continuation of NATO. Why? Because they want the continuation of the Biden war in Ukraine. So these folks are morally and politically bankrupt. And the fact that they're now demonstrating for policies that they didn't even attempt to pass when they were in power, again, it reflects the kind of political contradiction that is going to result in this party not being an oppositional party, but is going to help create the condition for a real challenge to the Democrats as a oppositional party. Because as we see it, both parties have to be opposed. Both parties represent different aspects, different characteristics of neo-fascism. And for those of us who represent and work with and come out of the working class and understand that fascism is basically a capitalist reform, we see the absolute necessity for independent organization and independent struggle because we're not going to be able to defeat these forces relying on opposition coming from a party that's dominated by neoliberals and neoliberalism itself a fascistic expression.
Multi Tom Tom Booker took 750,000 from APAC. That small change in APAC terms. That is true, but understand small minds get consumed by small things, and little people get purchased for paltry sums. When you say that fascism is a capitalistic, what was the word you used?
Reform.
Reform. Can you elaborate on that, please?
Fascism historically in the West, in the metropole, in the center, in Europe, and in the U.S. emerges when there's a deep-seated capitalist crisis, and that crisis becomes a political crisis. And so you have these fascistic political movements that emerge that align themselves. They usually come out of what we call the middle class, or some of us call the petty bourgeoisie, and they align themselves with certain elements of capital. And what's the objective? The objective is to save capitalism. Usually, it's definitely always opposed to socialists and communists. And so their objective is basically to find ways to mitigate the crisis, but maintain the capitalist system. So it's a reform movement, basically.
Mm-hmm.
The problem they have today, though, Dr. Leon, is that unlike in the 1930s, where they used war basically to come out of the crisis in the West, um, there's not those kinds of opportunities because there's been such a fundamental shift and shifting of power away from the West. It's not anti-capitalist completely, but it is enough power being shifted that the Trump administration and before it, the Biden administration had a rude awakening to their inability to impose their will on the rest of humanity like they have in the past. That when they attempted to impose sanctions on the Russians and thought they're going to intimidate nations around the world to support the sanction regime, they quickly discovered that their ability to, in fact, impose themselves on the world, particularly in the global South, was not what it was just a couple of decades ago. So, the kind of fascist reorganization that's taking place now,
Mm-hmm.
is a manifestation of the ongoing capitalist crisis.
Today we were talking about this the hands-off march over the weekend today in class with my students, and a couple of them said, this wasn't our move. They said we all turned out and voted for Kamala Harris, and we were all revved up behind her campaign. And they said, but now what happened over the weekend was really the disaffected MAGA people who are just so disgusted with how they now find themselves being victimized by the Trump administration that they said, we just sat this out because that's not our fight. Your thoughts?
Well, I think that I'm sure the students are going to have an opportunity to continue to explore that
Mm-hmm.
because what we have seen with these demonstrations is, in fact, a very interesting, I would say, coalition developing, but a very interesting
Merger of interests.
There you go. That basically the many of the people who voted, who used to vote Democrats, who then switched over to the Republicans, and even Republicans who have been voting Republican for quite some time, they are discovering that the agenda of the Trump forces is an agenda that is opposed to their objective interests. And so they came out
Hmm.
with the Democrats, okay? And they are opposed to what they see as moves being made by the Trump administration that are threatening their interests. These are people who themselves work for the federal government or have friends and family that have worked for the federal government that are experiencing the draconian cuts being made among the federal workforce. There are elements that thought that they were going to be able to prosper under Trump and not have to be concerned about the possibility of higher prices for to live in the country. They are confused and concerned about the tariffs because they've been told that as a consequence of these new tariffs that there'll be higher prices, and many of them, some of them, come from the agricultural sector. That is really a concern, especially when you look at one of the main markets of U.S. agriculture is in Asia, and specifically with China, and the Chinese turned around and slapped a 34%
Hmm.
reciprocal tariff on the U.S. um, and they understand what that implies for them. So they're recognizing that basically there is a class difference between themselves and these oligarchs, Trump and his boys, that came out of the shadows and now running the government. Remember, and I think your listeners need to be reminded there's no democracy in the U.S. There's always been an oligarchy, but the oligarchy is usually operating in the shadows, in the
Hmm.
background. They hire their politicians. Remember when Trump first ran, he made jokes about the fact that how he used to basically buy politicians, how they used to come and grovel to him for money. Okay, but now there's so many of these oligarchs, and so many of them are young that what they're doing, Dr. Leon, they get bored. They are billionaires. They've done everything they needed to do, and now they want to dabble and play around in politics. So they stepped out of the shadows. And for the first time, openly we have forms of government now being openly administered by elements of the oligarchy, and people are starting to wake up to what is really happening here and wake up to the real class structure and class interests at play. People don't even understand. Do you know that is only the top 10% so of the population that's responsible for 50% of consumerism in the U.S.? The
That
rest of us are basically living from paycheck to paycheck. We
right.
we are barely we getting just what we need to survive. So everything has been skewed toward the top, and so people are starting to penetrate. And
Hmm.
that's really one of the objectives of some elements of the Democrat Party, including Bernie Sanders and AOC. They're using this opportunity not to build independent political power, but they're using this opportunity of people becoming more aware of these contradictions to do what? To drive people back into the Democrat Party. So you got Bernie Sanders on his sheepdogging campaign, you know, and raising the issues they wouldn't raise when the Democrats were in power. What happened to Build Back Better? What happened to universal child care? What happened to paid leave and paid parental leave?
Hmm.
You know, what happened to raising the minimum wage? They're talking about again the minimum wage, but they wouldn't talk about it when they was in power. But now they want to raise it now that Trump forces are in power. People are getting tired of the cynical manipulation of people, and that's why they're rejecting. That's why these these demos, they're not going to be that effective because basically they're not going to be able to win anything. But there are some issues being raised that are important, like the fact that they're getting ready to find $880 billion of so-called savings under Medicaid, a medical campaign, a medical program medical insurance, so-called insurance,
Hmm.
that millions of people are dependent on. Because you don't have a recognized human right to health care and to health. You have this you're being captured and controlled and exploited by a capitalist healthcare system that is resulting in thousands of people who die every year un, unnecessarily because of their lack of health care or under health care. um, there's no, so you have this dependence now people have on Medicare, Medicaid, but for the oligarchs, that's just an expense that can be eliminated. The same thing with food stamps, with the SNAP program,
Hmm.
that with all of the objective need that we have in the U.S., with people having to go to food food
Food
shelters
banks.
and food banks and all of this, in the richest country on the planet, they still now want to cut back on food support. And so, food scarcity is a reality. Okay.
Hmm.
And so this is the class program that these oligarchs have, and the program that they are advancing, and people are slowly beginning to wake up. So the Democrats, they if they were able to advance a real class program, then they could be a more effective opposition. But you can't advance a class program when you're also advancing a warmongering position too, like on Ukraine and all of the other wars that the U.S. is involved in.
Well, and I'm glad that you referred to Bernie as a sheepdog, because I've been calling him the Democratic sheepdog or the bell cow. And I've been trying to get people to see that as he has been out on his anti-oligarch tour and AOC has been with him, again, like Cory, they're lone soldiers. The party is not behind them. You have Pramila Jayapal in Washington with her movement to help people learn how to organize at the grassroots. The party is not behind her. I don't, the head of the Democrat, the new head of the DNC, Ken, what's his name? I can't remember his name.
Yeah.
Can't remember his name because he isn't anywhere. I haven't seen him anywhere. Um, so this is, as much as they want to make this out to be a movement by the party, as Hakeem Jeffries said, "Oh, we don't have to pay these protesters that are showing up at the town halls. The people are with us." And I'm saying, well, dude, have you looked at the numbers lately? 27% approval rating for the Democratic Party, the lowest since 1990. And because the assumption that they're making is that the disaffected Republicans, the people that are screaming at the town halls, are going to turn to the Democrats. Nay, nay, that ain't necessarily so, as Sport and Life would say in Porgy and Bess. That you there's no straight line between the two.
No, it really isn't. And I mean, everything's in play, or it should be in play. And everything will be in play because there's no resolution. There's no solution to
There's nothing being offered.
nothing at all.
As with the Harris campaign, no salute other than Bernie's removing the Social Security tax ceiling. Other than that, I haven't really heard any substantive legislation being proposed by the Democrats.
And if you did, it'd be a repeat of what we heard when Biden ran and all of the progressive policies that are going to be pursued. And when they assumed office, 80%, 85% of them were forgotten about. That's what the Democrats do. And people are beginning to wake up to that. That's why so many of them migrated over to Donald Trump.
Mm-hmm.
They wanted change, even though this was a second term for him. They wanted to see what he can do because they fell prey to the notion that there was this strong economy before COVID and this and that. And the Democrats, in trying to keep him out of the office, out of the White House, they were making an argument that everything was just fine. The economy was just fine. You all just don't understand how good the economy is. And people are like their lived experience is such where basically they are people paying 50%, 60% of their income on rent.
Mm-hmm.
And groceries going up every day. You can't even, most people can't even fill their car up anymore. The basic necessities to live are so expensive, you know, and there's no relief. So there's no working class program right now that either one of those two parties are offering. And that's why you have the confused migration into a really extreme right wing politics, and even elements of the left that aren't really offering things that can be the basis of a sound, progressive, or revolutionary opposition.
Talk about elaborate. You touched on this, but I want you to elaborate on the foundations of repression that have been laid by the Biden administration. There are a lot of things that are going on right now, such as this attack on academia and these attacks on students. Folks need to remember that the first attack on the students at Columbia was during the Biden administration. This was not a Trump move. This was a Biden move. The A lot of folks fell prey to this. The country needs to be run more by a businessman, and folks seem to forget Bill Clinton's reinventing government as we know it, which was the foray into neoliberalism and to privatization of public provisions and public services to the private sector. Um, a lot of these things that we're hearing from Donald Trump, as sinister and as evil and as anti-democratic as they are, he wasn't the progenitor of these things. A lot of these things came out of the Clinton administration, came out of the Obama administration, and came out of the Biden administration.
That's exactly correct. That's why it's so critically important for people to understand the class character of the politics of the U.S. and not fall prey to the theatrics of the duopoly, as though these two parties are pursuing contrary interests, contrary policies to the objective program and interests of the bourgeoisie, the capitalist class that run this country, that own this nation. You look at the Obama administration, for example. This was a clear example of the effectiveness of propaganda, of bait and switch, of us being focused on the image of Obama as this moral individual, the politics of hope, while on the side we see the curtain. But we're told, don't open up that curtain. Don't look behind that curtain.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you look behind that curtain, what you find is a capitalist class that is calling the shots for Obama. They're the ones who are the real owners, the real power to be. And so under the Obama administration, what are some of the repressive things that took place? What happened to Occupy Wall Street? That was shut down by the Obama administration. The Department of Defense 1033 program, the program responsible for militarizing police forces across this country, it was expanded 2,400% under Barack Obama. The expansion of the U.S. Africa Command was expanded 1,900%, putting U.S. boots on the ground to fight so-called terrorists. The attack on Africa, the attack on the most prosperous nation on the African continent, Libya, took place under the Obama administration. And let's put in perspective that attack and what's happening even today with Gaza. We know that officially they say it's more than 50,000 people who were murdered by the Israeli fascists at this point. But many people say it's much higher.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we know for a fact that with the attack in 5 months, 4.5 months, when they attacked Libya, it's estimated that at least 30 to 50,000 people were murdered. What's the difference? The difference is the exposure, the lens. We weren't allowed to see the carpet bombing that was taking place, to to enforce a so-called no-fly zone. We didn't hear the screams that we hear now when U.S. bombs are falling on schools where Palestinians are sheltering and children are burning to death, and we hear their literal screams. We haven't seen the images of people being burnt to death outside of hospitals. We're not seeing we didn't see those kinds of images, but they took place. And it took place under this criminal Barack Obama. How many police were prosecuted under the Obama administration as they were shooting black folks down across the country? One, Walter Scott, the Walter Scott murder. Why?
Mhm.
Because he was captured and you couldn't get around that. But Mike Brown and everybody else, that was papered over by the Obama administration. The coup in Egypt, the coup in Honduras, the coup in Ukraine, they served as the basis for the war being fought today.
Mhm.
Okay, you had the coup in 2014, and then the green light that was given to the coup makers to attack the Russian-speaking Ukrainian citizens in the eastern part of Ukraine because they were opposed to the coup. So, folks, you got to keep this stuff in perspective. Don't let these people use you. They have their own program, and it ain't your program.
You know, another thing that unfortunately, folks have incredibly short memories, because as we look now at Donald Trump attacking student protesters, attacking universities, people seem to forget that Joe Biden tried to implement the Ministry of Truth, that he tried to implement the Information Governance Board with Nina Jankowicz, and wanted the Department of Homeland Security to scour social media as a way of protecting us against disinformation, when in fact what they were really trying to do was deplatform people that were challenging the dominant narrative. Again, that was a Biden play that Donald Trump has merely just taken the ball and tried to carry it across the goal line.
Logic of repression that we see unfolding today in the U.S. was put in place under the Obama administration and accelerated under I'll say Bush, under the Biden administration. That basically the kind of censorship that was normalized that came out as a consequence of the first Trump administration and the whole Russian Gate fraud. It continued on steroids under the Biden administration, and even people like Zuckerberg talked about now. They can talk about it. The enormous pressure that was put on Facebook, now Meta, to go along with the censorship regime that was being imposed on Silicon Valley, or Silicon Valley was embracing for themselves. That is the period where basically anybody in opposition was criminalized. It was under the Biden administration that the Uhuru Three faced federal prosecution. Why? Because of their opposition to the Ukrainian war. It was under the Biden administration that we saw again whistleblowers being prosecuted, intimidated. Um, People had to remember that under the Obama Biden administration, you had more individuals prosecuted under the 1917 Espionage Act than all of the previous presidents combined. So we talk about fascism. Many of us have been arguing for a few years now. They have you all looking at and focus on Trump while they were slowly strengthening the repressive apparatus of the state. The neoliberals, who are fascists themselves, were slowly perfecting the repressive apparatus of the state and perfecting the rationalization of repression as Big Brotherism now embraced and normalized. So this is the foundation that we are dealing with today, the foundation that was laid primarily by the Democrats and now being used by the neo-fascists under the Trump forces.
A couple of things I want to try to, I know our time is limited and I really appreciate you granting me the time that you are. This whole immigration issue, the deportation, the response to the immigration issue relative to the deportation of these Venezuelans to El Salvador. Now we find that the court has ordered that one gentleman from Maryland has to be returned by 11:59 tonight. There are a couple of elements to this. One, I have been saying to folks that the fact that these individuals were deported without due process, that the elimination of due process here is the thing that people need to focus on. That sending these Venezuelans to El Salvador without due process was really a Trump trial balloon to try to see how far they could go with this, because if they're able to get away with this, and now what we're finding out is it's not just one guy that made that had no criminal record. Most of the people that were sent had no criminal records. That it's really a trial balloon that we could very well be the real target, as they are anticipating public outcry, public resistance to the oppression, the economic oppression that is already here, and larger oppression on the horizon.
I think you're absolutely right, Dr. Leon. But I would probably argue that the trial balloon, in terms of how much power the state has to repress not only non-U.S. citizens, but U.S. citizens, was floated quite some time ago. Mm-hmm. And the place where they were sending people who were dissidents and who were labeled as so-called terrorists was Guantanamo.
Guantanamo Bay, sure.
Guantanamo was it. So now what you're having is an expansion of that process. And you're right. Process that they play like there's some kind of due process sometimes with Guantanamo.
Right.
But very often you were kidnapped and you ended up in Guantanamo. Now you're being kidnapped out of state, U.S. state authority, and sent down to a prison in El Salvador with no due process. But you're right. If they can get away with that, and Trump is talking about the possibility of U.S. prisoners, people who theoretically were subjected to so-called due process, whether or not they could be, in fact, transferred to foreign soil, we're looking at the possibility of a new industry. I think Erica Keynes wrote a piece about this a few weeks ago, in terms of like prison she calls it prison imperialism. Mm-hmm. That basically you have another kind of offshoring. Now, the Trump forces are trying to bring back the manufacturing base to the U.S., but now you have the possibility of a new industry being offshored, prison incarceration. And you're right. Who will be the ones? Well, the ones who are going to be the ones subjected to that are the same ones who are in the prison industrial complex in the U.S. Us.
And folks,
the mass incarceration.
And I'm glad you brought up Guantanamo, because you're absolutely right. Because I had been saying at the forefront of the Guantanamo issue, when Donald Trump first started sending those illegal immigrants to Gitmo, he was saying that they were terrorists. And he was using that word terrorist so that people would be comfortable with sending those folks to Gitmo, because that's where the terrorists go. So this language and this process is all subterfuge to get folks comfortable. And what did the president of El Salvador tell little Marco Rubio? You can send us your guys. And Marco said, no one's ever made that offer to us. We're going to have to take a look at that. Folks need to understand the setup here. This is nothing but and now the Venezuelans are angry. The Venezuelan immigrants that came here backed Donald Trump. Now they're pissed because he's pulling the rug out from under them, and they're talking about deporting something like 300,000 Venezuelans.
Yeah, they lost their temporary protective status because they were brought here basically to as part of the ability or the attempt to undermine the Venezuelan government. And these are a lot of these individuals. And I want to, slander them like Trump did. But one of the reasons why we didn't have the kind of rebellion that happened in Venezuela a few years ago when we had the recent election, is that many of the elements that were involved in that vicious racist violence in Venezuela back in 2017,
Hmm.
these are individuals who ended up in the U.S., many of them, okay? And now they are being reintroduced back into Venezuelan society. But
The Juan
yeah,
Guaido crew.
there you go. And so, but they just they're pawns also. They've been used, okay?
Hmm.
And when
Hmm.
you are uneducated, you can find yourself being used by powerful forces in that way against your own interests and against the interests of your own nation. But staying with this whole repressive thing in the U.S. and who might be the next targets, people need to be reminded that the 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 psychological foundation of Palestinians and the dehumanization process that they have been subjected to, and then transferring that to people like African Americans is not too much of a distance, okay? And that process of criminalizing a whole group of people is already in place. You remember the black identity extremists? These were the ones that are the domestic terrorists. This is
Hmm.
the FBI category that emerged. Okay, and so this identification of black folks who may be in opposition to the duopoly, to the U.S. colonial capitalist state, that we become the black identity terrorists, the domestic terrorists, and before you know it, they'll find a legal loophole to have us in El Salvador or someplace else. So this fascistic phase that we are going through right now is going to become even more intense, and people need to understand that, and that's what you need, and they need to understand where their objective interests lie, how they're going to protect their human rights, when basically the human rights of people being violated every day. When you have a state, a government, a nation that can actually rationalize the systematic slaughter of thousands of people in Palestine, if they can do that and rationalize that, what do you think they can do and will do to you?
Uh,
You are the racialized other. Understand that.
we've got 2 minutes left. If you, not necessarily this particular audience, but as we have discussed and analyzed Barack Obama and Joe Biden, some might misinterpret this as either an anti democratic rant or a pro Trump rant. If you could, in 90 seconds, explain that you and I know, we're we are political scientists, not political operatives. And this is analysis. This isn't pro candidate, pro party dialogue.
Not at all. That basically, if you understand your history, if you understand the history of this nation, if you understand the character of these two parties, then you will understand that both of those parties represent the same interests, but different factions of the capitalist class. Okay. And I say for myself, and I characterize it this way, and I take the heat for this. Uh, Joe Biden is a racist pig. Donald Trump is a racist pig. Barack Obama is a white supremacist pig. That basically these people are enemies of collective humanity. And so there's no pro Donald Trump. Donald Trump is a true backward white supremacist, but he's no more a white supremacist than a Joe Biden, who's a Zionist and white supremacist who opposed busing back in the day. Okay. So, this is the objective reality. We've got to understand who the enemy is and who our friends are, and not be confused by those polar opposites.
Brother Ajamu Baraka, thank you. I know your time is short. I got you out on time. Greatly appreciate it, man. Thank you. Really, really look forward to having you back.
Thank you so much, Doctor.
Folks, Lee Ricks, thank you very much for your super sticker. Greatly appreciated. Cherie, I think you asked the question, who wrote Doctor My Eyes? I think that's Jackson Brown, who wrote that and with the group. I think it's Jackson Brown that did that. As I say to my son, who is a music major, you got to know your music. You got to know your music. Folks, listen, if you've been tuning in and you have not gone back through the site to catch up on past episodes of Connecting the Dots, you are truly missing out. We've had brilliant minds from around the globe, truth tellers, insiders, scholars, journalists, breaking down what's really happening and going on in this country as well as around the world. My sit down with John Jeter, for example, the episode is called Divide and Rule, the Elite's Playbook to Control America. Jeter peeled back the layers of American class war, which, for example, Brother Ajamu Baraka just gave you a very brief insight into. And these conversations, they don't expire. So when you have some time, you can go back to the site. You can revisit some of the, what I think are just phenomenal conversations that I've had with some of the critical thinkers, not only in this country, but around the world. And in many regards, you'll find that you'll find some common themes, that a lot of these conversations are built upon each other. So you can go back, you can binge, you can catch up on a lot of what's going on, and you will then be much better able and prepared to connect some dots. You'll never see the news. You'll never view the news. You'll never interpret the news. You'll never analyze the news in the same manner again. And here's the thing, and again, Lee Ricks, thank you for that super sticker. There are no tariffs here. There are no tariffs, Lee. There's no tariff that is going to be imposed upon you. Even those of you that are watching from a foreign country, in the Netherlands and in other countries, if you are so gracious enough to bless us with a contribution, there will not be a tariff imposed upon you for that contribution. So with that, folks, you can find the links in the chat room right here, or you can look at the go to my channel and look under videos. So remember that we are doing this for you, but we can't do this without you. Again, I want to thank my dear friend and brother Ajamu Baraka for joining me today. Thank you all so much for listening to the Connecting the Dots podcast with me, Dr. Wilmer Leon. New episode tomorrow. Please follow, subscribe, leave a review, share the show. You can follow us on social media. All the links, of course, are listed below. And remember that this is where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge. That talk without analysis is just chatter, and we don't chatter here on Connecting the Dots. See y'all tomorrow. Until then, I am Dr. Wilmer Leon. Have a blessed remainder of your day. Peace. I'm out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.